The world is telling us as men to be common, to fall in line, to fall short of any visions or plans God has for us. But what about being uncommon? This is a movement of men seeking to build an eternal legacy. A journey of men on mission to rise above the common, to experience sustainable life change. This is Uncommon Disciple. Welcome to the Uncommon Disciple podcast. My name is Michael Bowen, and with me, as always, is my good friend, Jared Gibson.
Hello.
How you doing, Jared?
Doing good.
Doing good?
Yeah, we're a little bit late this week getting an episode out, but bivocational, and you and I both, and you had a travel horror story this weekend trying to get back. So
well, I think some of us are tri-vocational.
Right, exactly.
Like, we were just praying about that as before we came on this episode, just the busyness and distractions in life. And we've, made a commitment to do this podcast and God makes the time. So yes. We're just grateful to be on the air. We're grateful for everyone that listens in and sends us words of encouragement. We received a few emails and text messages this week, and it's just always good to hear how guys are grabbing onto the things that are shared on this podcast. So we pray that it's blessing you. And this episode is going to be a little bit challenging. Yeah. It challenged me as I was praying about what we would do. We don't have a guest on per se. It's going to be Jared and I talking about some things that were deep on my heart as I was traveling. But as I had come back from travel, Jared, you know about this group called the Dads of Castle Rock here in Castle Rock, Colorado. It's a group that was made out of a spoof, right? Mm-hmm. They had the moms of Castle Rock and the dads got together and said, we'll do a Facebook page. Right. And so they started this Dad of Castle Rock, and it's turned into quite, I don't want to say a ministry, right? Because they don't consider themselves to be a Christian organization, but there are some good brothers that are planted in this group in leadership. As a matter of fact, Brad, who's the vice president, was on one of our episodes. And what's neat is that they have a Facebook page, and it's only for men. Right. And dads can go on here, husbands can go on here and be transparent. People go on there and ask for just wisdom, or they go on there to vent. Mm-hmm. But this group is more than that. I mean, they do a lot of great things in this community. But I want to read a post if I could, because this post. I don't spend a lot of time on Facebook, but I'll peruse the Dads of Castle Rock, look for areas that I can pray for people. I'm not a big contributor on Facebook, but I do follow this page because it helps me to realize how many men in the world are hurting by just the input I see from this small community of men, right? I think there's a couple of thousand, I think, that are part of this group. So, but this post, and they keep it general, so there's no real names mentioned here. But it was posted on the Dads of Castle Rock page and this week. And it starts out saying, "Hey, everyone, I'm reaching out with a heavy heart for my brother-in-law. I'll call him Joe for ease, because we have hit a point where we don't know how to help him. Both my wife and my families have alcoholism that runs fairly heavily, but it's always gone untreated. I believe we've passed the point where Joe can continue on without treatment. He sneaks out of the house while his wife and kids are asleep and stays out until 5 a.m., drinking and probably using other drugs fairly often. He uses drugs heavily on hunting trips. We know about his cocaine use since high school, although for a long time we thought it ended when he had kids. And we believe he is being given prescription pills from family and friends of the family. I think Joe's mom would say the right words in recovery, but would enable him to continue his destructive path if she will even believe he truly has a problem. Just yesterday, Joe's wife said he needed to take a drug test or she'd divorce him, and he refused. I know her as a caring person who would likely be part of his recovery, but has been told so many lies she doesn't know how to trust him. I'm praying that anyone here that might have gone through a similar experience can help shed some light on what we can do to help Joe." Jared, I read this and a little bit of my backstory, but it really stirred up some feelings and emotions within me because I could relate to Joe. I could relate to Joe. Right. There was a time in my past, and I don't talk about it in depth with a lot of people, but there was a time in my life where I was this guy, Joe. I remember a time where I did sneak out of the house in the middle of the night and went off to drink and carouse. And my wife and kids were asleep. Mm. And I pre-planned it. Mm. Meaning it was, of all days, Valentine's Day. So I had bought some Valentine's Day cards earlier that day, thinking, well, if I come back in the middle of the night and she just so happens to be awake, I was out getting Valentine's cards, you know? And so when I read this, I just said, gee whiz, man, you know, it's just that kind of stuff creeps up on you. And it was like, my story's not unique, right? You know, our stories are never that unique, right? That there's someone else struggling with these things. And so we're going to talk a little bit about addiction, sobriety, and, you know, the road that I was led down. You know, I too, like this guy, Joe, who obviously it's not his real name.
Right.
I too had addiction issues that ran heavily deep on each side of my family, meaning my mom and my dad's family. And I didn't know what that meant growing up. You know, I was born in the 70s and kind of grew up in the 80s, and everyone was drinking or smoking cigarettes at that point. And I didn't really know about drug use until I probably turned about 12 years old, maybe 12 or 13. But I think I had mentioned this to you when I was teaching and preaching at this church. You know, my dad was a do as I say, not as I do guy, right? As he was sending me down to the corner deli to buy him a pack of cigarettes they were $1 back then, you know, and he'd say, don't smoke. And I'd look at him and like, well, you're smoking. Right. And so before long, at 11 years old, I was smoking cigarettes, and then the corner kids in Philadelphia, you know, they were always drinking or doing something. So it wasn't long before I started trying those things as well. But, you know, it continued on through most of my teenage life, where I just engaged in various, you know, types of activity, drug activity, drinking activities. And I thought it was a normal part of life. That was my normal. Right. Because I didn't see anything abnormal about it because of the people that I was surrounding myself with in school. And so, and I write about this in the book. You know, my family went through major trial and tribulation. You know, I didn't grow up a Christian, and my mom and dad separated numerous times, and we were always moving to a new place with new people, and I'd have to figure out a way to survive. You know, I've been working since I was 11 years old. So I don't know if this contributed to some of the things that I struggled with. And I just used this as a coping mechanism to cover up the pain of not wanting to think about my mom and dad's struggles. But as I grew up, I realized fairly quickly that addiction ran on both sides of our family. I don't know. All of my brothers and sisters in one time or another have struggled with drugs and alcohol. My sister's daughter, Mia, who was she was my niece, right? But I was her godfather. You know, I was there when she was born. I was there when she was baptized, and she died in June of 2020, not of a drug overdose, but of a drug-related overdose. Meaning, and I'll get into that story a little bit more, but since she was 11 years old, she was using drugs and using heavy drugs, heroin, and you name it, and she was doing it. And before you know it, she was living on the street. Jeez. And there was a point where Song and I were following her around to the different rehabs that she was at, and I could relate to her, but at the same time, I couldn't relate to her, right? Meaning, I could understand, you know, the cycle that she was in, right? And they, you know, the world calls it addiction, right? But she was in a cycle that she just couldn't break out of. You know, I would get into these cycles and I'd be able to break out of them. I was a very high functioning guy. You know, I could cover up, you know, this guy, Joe, doesn't even care anymore. The guy that I just read about, but I could still go to work. No one knew, you know, until I had confessed a song at one point that, you know, I was having a struggle. But this addiction here in our small town of Castle Rock, and I know it goes throughout the United States and the world. Gigi was on our last episode and told us that his dad struggled with cocaine.
Yeah.
Right. And so, these cycles or the addictions that guys use to cope, they run deep.
Yeah, they do.
Right. And so we're hoping to provide some guys some tools if you're in that world right now, whether you're struggling with pornography, alcohol, drugs. I'll talk a little bit about where I was led, down my path. And I know, Jared, you have some stories relating to your stuff. But, I think at the end of the day, the world does a good job in trying to convince us that this is a problem, a medical problem.
Yeah.
Right.
Just how you're born. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you're either born that way or, you get a diagnosis and you say, good. Now, at least I have an excuse for why I do the things that I do.
The label becomes the excuse.
That's right. Well, the label becomes the identity.
Exactly.
In that point, right?
Yeah.
So I'll talk about, I think at one point I was 16 years old or 17 years old. They had me go to an AA meeting, with all these adults that were smoking and, it was the funniest thing, right? Because there was like 3 of us and they're like, hey, you got to go start doing some AA meetings.
That's crazy.
And I'm like, well, how about someone just sit down with us and tell us what's going on?
Sure.
Why are you sending it? Because they didn't know what to do. Right. So anyway, I would listen to these old guys tell these stories, in these meetings, smoking cigarettes and blah, blah, blah. And, and then it was story after story after story. And it didn't scare me as a kid,
So the stories didn't go, oh, I don't want to be like that. I don't want to become that. Okay, right.
I was just like, what are we doing here? As a kid. But, as I got older, I went back, when I was older to an AA meeting, and it really opened my eyes. Right. And some people, listen, there's a lot of good programs out there that people use to stay sober.
Sure.
Right. And I say that they're programs. Right. And I think I shared this with you before. I know a lot of guys that got sober that were still the biggest jerks to their family and their kids and to the people around them. It was like, just go start drinking again, man, because you're an idiot.
Right.
But, for me, I realized that it wasn't necessarily a medical condition. It was a spiritual condition. Sin was the root cause of all of my behaviors. I was just making a choice to go and engage in the activities that I was engaging in.
Yeah.
That was my path. Right. I'm not discounting any, programs or meetings that people go to. I'm not saying that at all, because if it's working for you, then do it. Right. If that's what you're using to stay clean or dry or whatever you want to call it, then amen. But I believe that there's more than just staying physically sober.
Yes.
I think there's a spiritual sobriety as well.
Amen.
Right. Because in the Bible actually talks about being sober. It talks about alcoholism in many different areas. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight. But, one thing that, that really struck my heart as I was, reading this Facebook post was the story of my niece, Mia. And I had asked, Song, I just wanted to remember some dates. But, there was a point when we moved to Minnesota, Jared, that she came out and lived with us.
Okay.
She came to us and said that she was pregnant and everyone was telling her to get an abortion. And we weren't telling her one way or another what to do.
Sure.
We said, hey, you don't have to make that decision right now.
Right.
Right. And if you need some space and some time to think about it, why don't you just come and stay with us? We'll pray, we'll see what your options are. But we didn't tell her, don't do this.
Right.
We just said, hey, come out and get around some different environment. And then you can make the decision, whatever you want to make. Yeah. Right. So she comes out with us and we were at the point where we were healthy as a family. So we're, letting our teenage niece, and I think she was 19 at the time, come in and she stays with us, man. And she gets better. In a few weeks, man, you could just see this, this kid coming out in her.
Life coming back.
Well, she never had a chance to grow up, bro. Right. So she didn't have a healthy family surrounding her growing up. Right. And I won't get into that because it's not going to be healthy for anyone that might listen to this, that are involved with, that were involved with her life. But I'll just say that it wasn't a situation that I would want my kids growing up in. And so she comes out and she's, part of the family, and, we're getting feedback from other family members. Oh, she's never going to get better and she's just going to use you guys, or, or why is she there with you guys? And we're getting blasted for reaching out, giving her an option. And so she's with us for a while, and then she miscarriages the baby. Right. And in Minnesota, they give people that are struggling with addiction Suboxone. Right. This is a drug that helps people with opioid addictions to come off the drugs. Okay. So they give you a drug to come off a drug.
Sure. Makes sense.
No, it doesn't make sense, bro. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But again, for some people, I mean, they've had success stories with this drug. So, who am I to argue? And again, I can't tell anyone what to do to get sober, Jared. I'm not here to do that. Yeah. I'm here to share my story. You're here to share your story. Yeah. I'm here to share a little bit about Mia's story. So she's with us. She miscarried the baby, and this obviously creates a lot of hurt and trauma within her, right? Yeah. So that shame, guilt cycle starts to fire up again. And in the middle of the night, while she's staying with us, I hear like a loud banging in our house. It's like 2:00 in the morning. And you know me, man, I'm hyper vigilant. Like I'm grabbing my weapon. Like, what was that?
Got the mag light.
Yeah. Like I'm ready.
Perimeter search.
I'm going around the house and then I see a piece of luggage by my front door. And I don't hear anything. So it's totally quiet in the house. So I run upstairs and I tell Sonia, I was like, hey, are we expecting anyone? There's a piece of luggage by our front door. And she's like, no. And I said, well, is Mia planning to leave tomorrow morning? She's like, not that I know of. So I go down and sit in the living room in the dark because it was dark.
Sure.
And I see Mia creeping down the stairs in the middle of the night. And she turned the light on and sees me sitting in the living room like, hey, you going somewhere? And she's like, yeah, I'm going to the airport. I'm going back to Florida. And I'm like, cool.
Right.
Like, why are you sneaking out? Right. Why didn't you just tell us? You're not going to say goodbye to anybody?
Right.
But she had already made up her mind that this is what she needed to do. Right. Because she had no vehicle, hardly any money.
Right.
And so she couldn't go out and get dope if that's what she was looking to do. So she knew if she got back to Florida, she could go back to her old lifestyle. So I said, hey, listen, you're not being held hostage here, but I'm going to ask you to just go say goodbye to everyone.
Right.
I'll take you to the airport. You don't, because she couldn't get the Uber at like 2:00 in the morning. We're living in the residential neighborhood south of Minneapolis.
Ain't no Uber drivers out
there.
No
Uber driver coming down this way.
Right.
So I was like, hey, I'll take you to the airport. Like, no problem. Like if you're done, great. Like we're not holding you hostage. So Song, talks to her a little bit and I take her in the vehicle and I'm a little bit angry.
Sure.
Right? Like, why are you doing this?
Right.
Like, this is the part I just didn't understand.
Sure.
But I did understand. Right. So we get to the airport and then she forgets her driver's license. They're not letting her on the airplane and just created all this, struggle. And I say, hey, you figure it out. So she found a way to get on the airplane and goes back to Florida. And Song and I knew at that point that this would probably be the last time that we saw Mia. Right. And so a couple of weeks goes by and we don't hear anything. And every once in a while we, reach out and, check on her and we wouldn't hear much back. We thought we would hear from the rehab. Usually that's who we hear from.
Sure.
They'll call Uncle Mike, call Aunt Song and, they'll talk to us and we'll go down and see her. And then we find out that she gets admitted to the hospital because she gets an infection in her blood.
Ooh. And
one of her arteries to her heart had become so bad that they replaced it with a pig valve.
Wow.
Right. So she gets this pig valve put in her heart. And so she's now like, you got to stay in the hospital. And this is during COVID.
Sure.
Right. You've got to stay in the hospital. You have to make sure your body takes to this, this new genetic material that's in your body. And so she's being pumped up with antibiotics, blah, blah, blah. Well, evidently, the story that we heard was that she got a visit from one of our family members. And this family member, threw some news onto her lap and Mia ripped out all of their IVs in the middle of the night and walked out of the hospital.
Oh man.
And we heard this and we knew that was going to be it.
Yeah.
So about 2 weeks later, we get a call from Mia's boyfriend at the time. He actually was a good guy. From what we were able to gather from him, he was trying to help Mia get better, and tells us that she had passed away. Her body went septic. He rushed her to the hospital, but there was nothing at that point that they could do.
Jeez.
But, a lot of times when we're in this addictive cycle, Jared, this cycle that I've been talking about, we don't let the tape play out to see what that end could be.
Right.
And we know that nothing is guaranteed in life. Tomorrow's not guaranteed.
Yeah.
But this really rocked us, right?
Yeah.
How delicate life is. Now, the silver lining to this story, Jared, it is that she gave her heart to Christ while she was with us.
Oh, wow.
And, I don't know, and I say this, I don't know if God wanted her to stay in that life cycle that she was in, because she was living a horrific life on the streets, being passed around, and this beautiful young girl caught up in this drug cycle, this drinking cycle, this street cycle. It really rocked our family. And, this is during COVID.
Yeah.
So, if someone out there is listening and you're struggling with addiction, or someone that's struggling with addiction, there's no easy path to the end.
Yeah.
It's usually going to be a long, drawn out process. Now, do I believe that God can miraculously heal anyone?
Yeah.
Absolutely. And that's our hope. That's the hope of Christ. And I've seen people miraculously healed.
Yeah.
Never had to drink again. And Mr. Dave talked about it.
Yeah.
Remember? My road wasn't perfect. I had some bumps and bruises. I fell down a few times and got back up.
Sure.
But at the end of the day, each day is a success when you're not using or drinking. Right. So, or visiting porn.
Yeah.
Or whatever your addiction might be. Right. And so at the end of the day, I think for me, I had to figure out why I was running to these things to, cover up, pain or hurt or feelings of shame and guilt, and once you start in that cycle, Jared, of shame and guilt, you're just using to keep covering up. And the more that you use, the more shame and guilt piles up. So if you stop using, it stops happening. Right. So anyway, that's the story of me. I'm going to share a Bible verse because I think it's applicable. Peter writes in his epistle, in his first epistle, in the first chapter, he says, "Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, not conforming yourselves to the former lusts, as in your ignorance. But as he who has called you is holy, you also be holy in your conduct, because it is written, be holy, for I am holy." I shared that verse when I preached.
Yeah.
And that kind of talks about the mission of Uncommon Disciple, living a life set apart for God.
Yeah.
And to live a life set apart from God is sometimes difficult with all of the distractions that the world throws at us.
Yeah.
We live in a world that loves to throw distractions at us.
Yeah.
And whether it be, again, watch a sports event, right? How many distractions do you see when you watch a UFC fight or, a football game? Yeah. And I watch these things.
They're everywhere. Yeah.
There's pharmaceutical commercials.
Yeah.
There's alcohol commercials. There's bad food commercials.
Right.
Right. So you're being programmed, television, you're being programmed of these things. And so if you're already struggling with drugs and alcohol and you see a Bud Light commercial come on or whatever, other type of alcohol, pops up on the screen, it could trigger you to go,
that sounds good right now.
That looks really good. And because you're in this heightened state of euphoria watching a fight or a football game, that just kind of accelerates.
You want to plus the mood that you're feeling.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So let me ask you. So you shared a little bit of a story with me before we got on the air about your path with some addictive personality issues that you had relating to pornography, right? So there's some similarities, aren't there?
Yeah.
The story I told you.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think like any cyclical life pattern that we get stuck in, especially on the addiction front, I mean, it's all the same thing. I mean, I really don't see addiction to pornography, addiction to sex, addiction to different hard drugs, alcohol. I mean, I believe that almost anybody is susceptible to some form of addiction or another.
For sure.
Some people, like my wife, her addiction was working out, and controlling. And so sometimes addiction is control, some of it is trauma and dealing with things in the past. But what is the biggest ingredient always missing from it is God, right? And so, with my story, I was a teenager, and I was dealing with my mom's death, that had been a few years prior. Home life, as I've shared in the past, wasn't good, I was dealing with a lot of decisions I had to make when I was 13 and a lot of responsibilities when I was 13, 14, 15 that a normal 13, 14-year-old doesn't have to deal with, to be kind of vulnerable. I picked up my mom's casket when I was 13. And then my dad had a bargaining with the funeral home to get the cheapest one possible. So we get a copper penny colored one because it's the cheapest one. What 13-year-old should ever be in that situation, right? And so I had a lot of anger. I had a lot of issues. I was constantly, like, I'd be woken up in the middle of the night told, you're a piece of junk, you're worthless. Like, this is just like literally over leaving a cabinet door open.
Yeah.
And like, I would be brought out to be lectured multiple nights a week until like 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, told that, they had problems with my brother. They thought he was autistic and he didn't speak till he was older and he was weird and they didn't want to go through that again. And then I was called a mistake as a teenager, right? Still processing with mom's death, then being told by your father, you're a mistake. I never wanted you. We didn't want any more kids. And so I'm carrying that into my senior year of high school. And the only focus I have is I want to find a way out. I want to get out of here. I want to never live here again. And the thought of suicide never crept in because of my grounding in faith in Jesus, because I do know that this is where suicide for a lot of young folks that are going through this, they're being told by the people that gave life to them that they are a mistake, that they should have never been born. That's usually number one statistic for suicide. Also, the number two statistic for kids that grow up in that environment is drug addiction and alcohol. Usually it's some type of substance to numb the mind. Like, the mind is a loud talking thing. Like, I believe in demonic forces that come through. I mean, if you read C.S. Lewis's Screw Tape Letters, the demonic forces are manipulators of words, or they whisper. Yeah. Like, if you've ever had those strange thoughts in your mind, those thoughts aren't of God. They're not of the Holy Spirit. What are they? Some of them are sinful thoughts, but some of them I honestly do believe it's demonic, that whisper things and like, or you should go try that, or, like, and whisper like those temptations into your ear. And so I was grounded in God, but my dad one time came home and he said at work he had stumbled upon some pornography on the web. So like, this is the early stages of dial-up internet.
Dial-up.
Yeah.
That goes back away.
Oh, bro. Yeah. This puts a little date on things, but he tells me all the information, all the sites and stuff, where to go. Now, keep in mind, at this age, I'm a teeter-totter. Yeah. I'm teeter-tottering between wanting to do what's good but being tempted to do what's bad. Yeah. And so I'm at a teetering point in my life. And then all my dad does is just list out all these different adult content sites.
Mhm.
So what does an 18-year-old teenager do? Goes to the keyboard after he thinks about it for a long time, and he starts looking. Hook, line, sinker.
Yeah.
I spiral very quickly out of control into finding more and more ways to get more and more. And it happened so quick. And I kept thinking and like praying over it, and like
Well, there's a whole chemical process
Right.
that occurs, right? When you see pornography
Right.
or you put a foreign substance into your body,
Yeah.
right? You get a dopamine hit,
right.
right? And that high that you get is something that you seek after more. And sometimes that comes naturally for us, right?
Right.
You could eat a good steak
Right.
and have a dopamine bump,
Right.
right? But it's minor. It's just a bump, right?
Mhm.
You could have a significant dopamine bump when you look at pornography or
Yeah.
engage in, some type of drug activity.
Right.
You know.
And so I struggled off and on. And there were times in my early 20s when I was working where I would take a lunch break and I would go home, and I knew that there was no one in the house, and I would sneak in and I would spend maybe 2-3 hours binge content downloading of pornography. But one of the biggest things that I noticed in my addiction cycle, never once did I ever stop and ask my question, why am I doing this?
Yeah.
There's never the thought. It's just more, release. Oh, I feel like junk. I don't want to do this again. To, that sounds good. Oh, I need it. And then it's just, but you never ever stop the cycle to go, why? Do I need this? Do I really need this? And, I carry this into marriage too. And I thought when I got married, I'm like, oh, this will fix it. It got worse.
Well, that's it. Right. I mean, there was a point, and I remember this, and it's interesting because even in my teenage years, I remember this. Well, if when we move in the new place, I won't do that anymore. Right. And even in my adult life, I would do it. It's interesting because when I joined the military at 17, I put off all drug activity.
Mm-hmm.
Like I did drink a little, but I was so afraid there was a consequence, right? There was that story that I just shared on Facebook. This Joe's wife said that she would divorce him if he doesn't go get a drug test. Mm. Well, I'd say, go do it.
Yeah.
Separate, show the hard love, because my consequence, if you use drugs in the military, you get kicked out and you get a bad conduct discharge, right? Unless you fight it. There was a guy in our command who was a good guy, and I really loved him, but he got addicted to meth while he was in the Navy, and you just saw him spiraling out of control, man. And everyone's trying to cover for him and cover for him, and you get these random urinalysis that pop up. That's the thing, right? That's your accountability, right? You could show up to work and they go, "Hey, Jared, you got to take a piss today," right? It's like, oh crap, like if you use the night before, you're out.
Sure.
There's no way to cover it up. And so this guy popped on his UA, his urinalysis, and was discharged out. But there was a consequence and accountability that I enjoyed. I'll just say that I enjoyed the fact, my desire to want to be a good military person, right, was outweighed my desire to want to go use drugs. Right. So I think at some point you got to figure out what that is for yourself. Right. So for you in your addiction, right, you were able to go figure out and reverse engineer what was causing you to go to this.
Yeah.
Right. And I think let's just call that the first lesson. Right. Because what I've learned, Jared, and I wrote this down for myself, failure is your roadmap to victory in recovery. Right. So I'll tell you, there was a point in my cycle, when I would talk to different guys in recovery, they were living in such fear of relapsing that they couldn't live. Dude, they were afraid to go anywhere. Like if you drink a kombucha, you're going to relapse. Like it was like it was that bad, bro. And I was like, that sucks.
Right.
Because the Bible tells me God has not given a spirit of fear,
Sure.
but a power, love, and a sound mind.
Right.
Like that's what I believe.
Right.
Right. So if I'm going to continually live in fear of relapsing, what kind of life is that?
Right.
That's not a life. Right. How do we have a life that's fruitful? Right. And, one thing that people don't realize, Jared, in Galatians 5:20, the Bible actually talks about this as well. It talks about drugs, and people don't understand if you don't break the Greek down, right? The Bible says this in Galatians 5. We'll start it in 5:19. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies. And it goes on, murderers, drunkenness, all of these things. But right after idolatry, that word for sorcery is actually the word witchcraft. And you know what the Greek word for witchcraft is?
What is it?
Pharmakia, where we get our word pharmacy. So if you think about it, like drugs or alcohol, these are just mixtures, right? That open up a realm in the spiritual world. And I agree with you. I believe that when you do that, it opens up a demonic realm of activity in your life, right? So you just open doors. Yeah. And that's why there's got to be caution, right? Yeah. So I know a lot of Christians that drink beer. Yeah. I don't judge. And it's like, hey, cool. If you can handle it, awesome. Yeah. And just just use it in moderation. Like the Bible talks about. It says, don't be a drunkard. Yeah. Right. I believe that if you're in a position of spiritual leadership, you shouldn't be drinking at all. It's just my opinion. And people will argue with me and tell me, and I just say, hey, listen, you're leading by example. Set the example. There's kids watching you. Right. So do everything that you can to set a good Christian example. Well, Jesus drank, everyone will use every excuse to excuse their behavior or their sin. Sure. Right. And so I would say, that first lesson is if you're having a lot of losses or failures in your life, use that as a roadmap to your victory or recovery. Reverse engineer it. Yeah. What's causing you? Get back to what's causing you to go there. Yeah. What are some commonalities that are happening that cause you to open up the porn or run to the liquor store or, in the middle of the night, go out and score some drugs? Like, what's going on right at that moment? Is it anger? Is it resentment? Is it hurt? Is it frustration? Is it shame or is it guilt? Is it one of these feelings? Because what I've learned, Jared, is you can't trust your feelings. Sure. You can't make a decision in your feelings. Yeah. It's the worst thing ever. It just can't. Yeah. Right. And so a lot of guys will make that decision, right? Like, I need drugs. It's like, no, you don't. You just think you do. And that's why you're running to go get it, or you need a drink, or you need to go look at pornography. And so I would say that, again, reverse engineer. Right. But what else I've learned, Jared, is number 2 is having a strong community around you. Yes. Of people. I always tell my kids this, run with the winners, surround yourself. You become the sum of the people you surround yourself with. So if you want to stop drinking or using drugs, stop hanging around with druggies and drunks. Yeah. Right. And a lot of times, especially in pornography, you're in your own little community. Yeah. Right. So you're not necessarily looking at porn with a bunch of guys. Right. You're not going, hey, let's have a big porn party. Right. It's like, it's not that. Yeah. The interesting thing though, the tech industry as a whole, and anyone listening that's been in the tech industry, it's probably one of the most, I would say, sexually depraved groups of people. Then I've seen more pornography addictions in IT than in any other line of work, because when you're you're on a gateway device to it 24/7, and men in IT travel all the time. They have late nights, especially ones that are on call. Well, bro, like sexual morality or these things, this isn't new, right? So just because, there's an image or media attached to it, this has existed for ages, right? But it's become more accessible, I'd say, in the present. Technology. And I'll say this, I grew up when there wasn't even cell phones or internet, right? Like you had to go sneak a magazine off the top shelf at a whatever, that was behind a paper bag type of thing. And you'd be in the corner over there, with your little skater magazine, like making pretend you're looking at a skater magazine. Like that was the way you did it. Mm-hmm. Right. But now, then you can't let your kids go to bed with their cell phone. You're like giving them an open world to pornography, especially if you don't have any accountability on those phones, right? Like Covenant Eyes or one of those one of those accountability software or app programs. So that's a challenge today. Is that things are so readily available with technology that you really have to put some safeguards in place to keep yourself safe. Yeah,
absolutely, and kind of like part of kind of like where like my story ended up is I ended up going to counseling because I needed help figuring out why am I doing this? And I had even checked into, there was a Christian recovering group for sex addicts. And I was like, well, maybe I'm a sex addict. Yep. But the more and more I sat at those.
You wanted the label, the excuse.
Exactly.
That's why I do what I do.
Exactly. Yes. But that was exactly why. But sitting through a lot of those sex addiction recovery things, the stories that those guys told that they like there was legitimately a sex addiction out there. And like the stories that these men told me of these crazy, basically Sodom and Gomorrah style stories of these crazy benders, and a lot of them involved drugs and stuff like that they got into. And then I remember sitting there going, I don't think this is me. And then I ended up going into counseling going like, and I told my counselor, they heard my entire story of my childhood and like told them about what I was dealing with the pornography that just kept creeping up. And like this Christian counselor, and they were then like, well, how's that sex addiction class going for you? And then I told them like, I'm not really sure that's me. And they're like, no, that's not you. Your issue is coping mechanism from your childhood pain that you dealt with. And this became your complete funneling. And this was your inappropriate funneling of that pain.
For sure. That was the other thing, Jared, these labels. Right. I would sit in some of these meetings, whatever, you just name a program out there. Right. But you'd hear people say, well, I'm an alcoholic. Hi, my name is whatever, or I'm a drug addict. And I was like, you're speaking that into your life. Like I couldn't see myself saying that to myself. Right. Like I'm just saying like, yeah, this is what I am. And then it's like, no, that's not what the Bible says I am. And that's not what I want. I want to be identified. I don't want to identify myself as that, not for any other reason, but I believe that words have power. Yes. And when you're speaking that into your life, it almost gives you an open door to say, okay, well, if I blow it, then it's because of that. Yeah. Instead of saying, what kind of resources can I utilize? Yeah. Right. And so for you didn't have a healthy community around you. So you sought out some counselors. Yeah. And hey, the Bible tells us that in a multitude of counselors, there's wisdom. And so, yes, that's a great idea. Right. And so, but a lot of people are so ashamed to admit. Sure. Right. And they say that's the first thing that you need to do. You need to admit that you have a problem. Yeah. Right. So if you can get over that hump and tell some brothers, and I tell people, man, if you're struggling, just come, we'll talk. Right. Like, I'm not going to run out and tell 20,000 people. Right. It's like, I want to help you through it. I'll share with you what worked for me. It might not work for you. Everyone's different. Some people don't, recover well with, with a recovery program or, with a 12-step program or whatever. Sure. It just, everyone's got a different path, Jared. Right. But I do believe that when you give it to the Lord, yes, that he begins to do the work in your heart, like with any other sin. Yeah. And like that even brings up, so when I was going through the counseling, this verse God gave to me during that time, and the more and more I chewed on it, the more and more it, in a way, it was like acid to the cycle. Yeah. And so it's 1 Corinthians 10, verses 13. No temptation has overtaken you except not to allow you to be tempted.
I'm sorry, let me read that again. No temptation has overtaken you except such as is common to man. But God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able with the temptation, but will also make a way of escape that you may be able to bear it.
Mm.
And like for me, when I read that, there's no temptation that has overtaken you except such as common to man. And so like we just talked about, there's no temptation. There's nothing out there that man hasn't seen.
That's right.
So I think a lot of times men that are struggling with addictions think that their situation's unique. It's not.
Mm.
But one of the biggest keys to this is like when it says God is faithful. So I think a lot of times that also men that are stuck in that cycle, they forget that God is faithful.
Mm.
Like, yeah. God can do this. God can do that. But when you actually look at that deep, dark secret inside of you, that addiction, like whatever that just has a hold of your heart, I know that without a doubt, when it came down to that, I'm like, yeah, God's faithful. But then when I thought about what I was doing, I was like, ooh, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
The faith of a mustard seed can move mountains. But that again comes down to faith.
Mm.
Our faith in God is going to determine the breaking, I believe, of that cycle. And then also he does not allow us to be tempted beyond what we are able to handle. And then he also gives us a way to escape so that we can bear it. And I can think of every single time I snuck away from, my wife. I too, when I was in the pit of pornography, I would wait for my wife to fall asleep. I would make sure that everything was good with that. And then I found an excuse like, oh, I'm on call tonight or I'm doing this. And I would sneak in there, pretend like I was doing a little bit of work, maybe turn a little music on. Sure enough, I was scheduling that time to go into it and to, you
see, the behavior is the same.
Yeah, exactly.
Jared. And a lot of people don't realize that.
Exactly.
Right? When you're doing things like that and sneaking around, right? It's the same behavior.
Yes.
With drinking or pornography. It's the same behavior. We use the same behavior to cover up our sin.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
So,
and, every single time that I can think of, there was always a way out. I remember even thinking, I remember the Holy Spirit even popping in going, you don't have to do this.
Mm.
I remember worship songs in the middle of looking at it, popping in my head. And I'm like, no, go away. But really what it had to come down to was, did I want to follow Christ or did I want to follow myself?
Yes. Well, I think that's the ultimate question for anyone.
Right.
To ask themselves. Right. Because, are you building up the kingdom for yourself?
Yes. Or
are you building up the kingdom as God intended you to build it for his glory?
Yeah.
And so, again, this is, this has been a pretty deep podcast, but I can also tell you this, that no amount of chasing me down would have helped in my circumstance.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that if you have a kid or a relative that is struggling with addiction that you don't keep trying. I'm not saying that. Right. But at some point, the person that needs the help is going to have to ask and want that help.
Right.
They need to hit, what's called that bottom, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And God allows it. He'll allow people to continue. And it's like our salvation.
Yeah.
There's a point where we realize how depraved we are and how much in need of a savior that we are. That's when we begin to open our heart and say, okay, Lord, I'm ready.
Yeah.
And you give your heart to Christ. And the same is true for anyone struggling with these types of issues, is that, God is patient and long suffering with us, Jared.
Yeah.
And sometimes in, pornography or alcoholism or drug addiction, it takes that patience and long suffering. And you have to realize that if you're in that right now, and you're struggling and you're having setbacks or failures, it's not the end. Your story's not over. Get back up and get back in the game.
Yeah. Get
some good people around you. Mm-hmm. Get a good group of guys around you that speak that speak the language, right? That understand the things of the Bible, obviously, but also understand that, maybe some of the struggles that you've encountered, and ask them what worked for you. or what's working for you, and then give it a shot.
Yeah.
Right. But to do nothing, it's not going to end well.
Yeah.
Right. Because we know the wages of sin is death, is what the Bible says.
Yeah.
And ultimately, the sin that you're engaged in is going to cause not just a physical death, but a spiritual death.
Yeah.
Makes sense?
Yeah. Makes complete sense. And kind of like my final thought about like what I shared is a challenge.
Yeah, give us the final thought, Jared, because we're wrapping it up here. This has been a deep one.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that we're going to talk more about this. We wanted to have a couple of guys on here that have had some success in this area just to get some different perspectives. But this week, this hit me hard, and we didn't have a guest lined up, and because of school starting and everything else, but it's been a crazy week.
Right. So
give us this final thought. And then, hey guys, we're going to have some other resources on. So if you're struggling in this area, just stay tuned.
Yeah. Yeah. We'll definitely have some more, on that. And so my closing thought is going back to the start of the story and what I experienced as far as like my father, sharing that content. I'm going to use a quick little ITL illustration. Within anything on the internet, anything within IT, any type of building or anything like that always has a security device on it. That security device is a firewall. That firewall is a gateway to the internet. It's it can be in people's homes. I mean, it's in the biggest, craziest, like anything on social media, like everything in this world has on the technology front has a firewall on it. And my challenge out there is to men, fathers, husbands. If you're the leader of the household, God has entrusted you to be that firewall. You are that gateway to your family. You have the responsibility to know what's coming into that house versus what's going out of the house, because the firewall also protects what's going out. And so you have the God ordained ability, especially through all things through Christ, who strengthens you to be that firewall. And that means we live in a world that is against our kids. You go to any news article, the world is after your children. You have a responsibility as a godly leader and man of God to stand up and protect your children. Put safeguards on your home internet. Put safeguards on their phone, lock their phones at night, put in protection, do what needs to be done, monitor the Netflix, monitor the Disney Plus, monitor the YouTube, monitor everything that's coming into your house. You're the gateway of content coming into your house, and you have the God ordained authority to go, hey, I don't think we should watch this. And that's my passion. I failed at being that early on as a dad, and my daughter almost, without giving too many details away, could have been kidnapped.
Yeah. That's another story.
Yeah. And that'll be another story that we get into.
But Jared, that's a great way to end, right? That men be that gateway.
Yeah.
The spiritual gateway and the physical gateway, because we're good at being the physical gateway, right? I go down and make sure the doors are locked in my house, make sure the alarms and the cameras are set up. It's like, that's easy to do.
Right.
It's harder to take the time to be that, to set up the controls in place to protect your family and safeguard them from other things that could get into the house.
Yes,
right.
Exactly.
So, thank you guys for listening. If this podcast, this episode blessed you, we'd love to hear from you.
Yes.
If you need prayer or if you're struggling with addictions, we'd love to send you some resources to help get you out of that. So shoot us an email, go to our website, www.uncommondisciple.com, or hit us up on Instagram. We love you guys.
Yes, absolutely. Have a good night, everybody.
Gentlemen, thank you again for listening to and supporting the Uncommon Disciple podcast. Be sure to visit our website, uncommondisciple.com, and download the 12 attributes of godly men.
And while you're on the internet, go ahead and run over to YouTube, like and subscribe to our channel. On our channel on YouTube, we're going to have a lot of bonus content, a lot of videos and behind the scenes, so you don't want to miss out on that.
And if you've enjoyed the content and what we've put out here with our guests, give us a follow on Instagram or Facebook, and and you won't miss any of the announcement or events that we have coming up. So be brave, be courageous, and be uncommon.